Good evening, my name is Jack Barnes. Leading up to ANZAC Day on the 25th April, being the celebration and remembrance of the Australian military and New Zealand military commemorating the Battle of Gallipoli, I thought I'd just go through a bit of the history behind the Gallipoli campaign and what led up to it. So, the world prior to World War One, prior to 1914, was very different from what we know today. The great powers at the time, Japan was a very small empire at the time. Japan had been a very isolated country for hundreds of years. It had been terrified by Christian advances into Asia. There was even revolutions in Japan that caused the autocratic dictator government of the shogun to close all borders to foreigners except for two major cities in Japan, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, I believe, from memory, well, from what I can remember. But then in 1840 something, I forgot the year it happened, an American naval squadron arrived in Japan and gave an ultimatum to the Japanese shogunate government stating that unless Japan opened itself to trade to the world and to America, the Americans would declare war on Japan, from what I can remember. The Americans went away for a year and then eventually came back, and Japan opened trade with America. This saw Japan make many great advances militarily and technologically. It also saw Japan change. Japan had always seen China as the cultural superior, or the cultural base for Japanese culture. Japan were rice farmers originally from the Chinese mainland, I believe, so there was that cultural connection. However, as Japan got more technologically advanced, it saw itself as superior to a lot of its Asian neighbours. This included China, and eventually Japan declared or took part of the Korean Peninsula. It also took part of the Sino-Chinese or Sino-Japanese Chinese-Japanese War, pretty much. Japan also took part in other great wars. There was the 1904 War, Russo-Japanese War, which saw Russia cede control of the Korean Peninsula to Japan. It also saw the acknowledgement by the world that Japan was actually a proper power that could beat European powers such as the Russian Empire. So Japan had a lot to gain. Japan also wanted to build an empire. First, I'll draw a little diagram. This is the Japanese mainland. Korean Peninsula, China and stuff. The main aim at the first of when Japan started modernizing its military, one of the main aims was protection, to protect itself from foreign powers. So nothing like the Americans coming to its borders and demanding trade with them could ever happen again. So it was to protect their sphere of influence. However, as the decades got closer to the First World War, Japan changed its ideology and wanted to expand its empire throughout the Asian Pacific region. And that was a problem. The problem was that major most of Asia at the time was owned by European powers. Modern day Indonesia was the Dutch East Indies. What was it? Oh, I believe it was the Dutch East Indies it was called. Australia, British. New Zealand, British. Singapore, British. Hong Kong, British. Philippines, American, won by the Americans in the Spanish-American War. Guam, American, won by the Americans in the Spanish-American War. Vietnam, then called Indochina, as well as Cambodia, was owned by the French. Thailand was an independent kingdom, but was not the strongest power in the world, but was still independent compared to the other powers. Hawaii was owned by the Americans. Eventually was an independent kingdom, and the Japanese did have quite a lot of interest in Hawaii as well, with trade and manufacturing. What was it? Papua New Guinea was split between, or modern day Papua New Guinea, it was split between Britain and Germany. A lot of the Pacific Islands were owned by the German Empire. Samoa, West Samoa was owned by the Germans, and East Samoa, that was called East Samoa was owned by West Samoa was American, that's American Samoa, and East Samoa was German at the time, German Samoa. And there was a whole lot of other ones. What was it? So you can see European colonisation did affect the Asian Pacific region quite a bit. So Japan wanted to expand its empire, but it was struggling because a lot of the European powers that Japan could not stand up to them at that stage controlled these regions. So China was the main China was a main target for Japan because it was a weaker, crumbling empire, and it was very close. And it was an Asian nation. That was very important as well. China had been crumbling for about 200 to 300 years. It was not a healthy nation at that stage. It had gone, the British, after the American Revolution in let's actually just check the board. American Revolution. Treaty of Paris. Alright, well, I think it was 1779 the American Revolution began, but I could be wrong about that. But the Treaty of Paris that made America independent was made in 1783. When that happened, the British lost the North American colonies, the 13 North American colonies that became the United States of America in modern day times. Because of this, the British needed to make another income. And the new colonies of the Indian subcontinent that they got were supposed to make tea. However, India became a very popular area to grow opium. Britain needed tea from China, so what ended up happening was the Chinese ended up having quite a drug problem with opium. The Chinese tried to shut it down, and simply this resulted in two wars known as First and Second Opium Wars, where the British tried to exploit the weakness of the Chinese Empire. I think it was the not Qing Empire. I forgot which dynasty it was, but it was one of the last Chinese dynasties, pretty much. So pretty much what happened was the Chinese lost Hong Kong to the British. I think Macau was lost at that point to the Portuguese. I could be wrong, that may have happened earlier. But yeah, I think Macau was a lot earlier, because I think it was Catholic Jesuit priests from Portugal who took Macau. But what ended up the reason I'm talking about that is China was weakened, and there were other wars, the Boxer Rebellion. In fact, Australia was involved when Australia's separate colonies, Victoria, New South Wales, and other colonies, and New Zealand were involved, but they didn't. I don't think they took part in any of the fighting. I think they were involved in the clean-up job afterwards. But what ended up happening afterwards, the reason I bring this up, about 50 to 100 years before the First World War, was it weakened China. And this allowed rising empires such as Japan to take advantage. Before the First World War, after the Boxer Rebellion, Shanghai became a foreign divided district area where each of the victorious powers in the Boxer Rebellion got a portion of Shanghai. There was a British section, a German section, an American section, Japanese section, a French section, and a Russian section. So virtually every, and an Austrian-Hungarian section. Actually, I'm not sure if the Austrians were there. But virtually every power on this board except for the Ottomans, I believe. I could be wrong about that, but just wait a sec. Alright, so, that's the Dutch flag. So, just do that. Now, we'll move on to the next country. I've done it again. Oh, screw it. The Russians can have a Dutch flag. Or Luxembourgian flag. Alright, so we'll get to Britain. Britain was an expanding imperial power at the time. It had nearly reached its height around the start of the 20th century. It reached its height after the First World War, taking up old Ottoman land and German colonies. Ottoman and German colonies afterwards. Or Ottoman colonies and German colonies after the First World War. But Britain had gone through nearly 200 years of colonial wars, and had become one of the world's sole superpowers. It had the biggest navy in the world, and it as well virtually controlled virtually every continent, except, actually I'll take that back, they had colonies on every continent. The main colonies being in Africa. A problem with the British Empire that has come out in history a bit later was finances. The empire was costing a lot of money. Resources out of Britain were just flowing to these colonies, and it was causing a problem. Now, there were a lot of benefits out of the empire, but it is believed there were some problems beginning in the British Empire at that stage. So the British Empire was a very diverse place, so there was a lot of work and mechanics of the empire. Alright, now we'll get to the United States. The United States, former British colony, that gained independence, as I said, in 1783 at the Treaty of Paris. America had a tumultuous or a rough period of time after its independence. It had gone through expansion and made a lot of money, and it expanded to the west coast of the North American continent. It had fought with Britain in the War of 1812, where the British burnt the White House to the ground, and the vice president, or the president of the United States' wife, I believe, got a knife and cut out the of George Washington. Just want to get a charger. Charging board over here. Right, but unfortunately America had the problem of slavery. Now, if you're British at this college or at International House, you'll probably know the name William Wilberforce. He was a British politician that tried to stop slavery on the island of Britain, or in mainland Britain, and the further British Empire later. It didn't get completely rid of slavery, but it started the abolition of slavery in Europe, or in the British Empire. Now, eventually throughout Europe, slavery became immoral, unchristian, blah 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 blah, very moral. A very moral thing. The only problem with this was it was very slow, and it did take time. The French wanted to continue with it, but revolutions in their colony of Haiti forced them to get rid of those ambitions. Eventually, a lot of Europe throughout the late 1700s to early 1800s abolished slavery. Now, did it mean complete equality? No, as you probably know from today with the civil rights events throughout the 1950s and mid to late 20th century, it did not solve all the problems, but it started the gears for change. So in America, unfortunately, there were two groups in America in the early 1800s, mid 1800s. There were two groups: slave states and non-slave states. Now, whenever a state was added to what was called the Union at the time, that were the Union of the American States, the original 13 colonies, but as they added further states, each state became a slave state or non-slave state, anti-slave state. Now, this became quite rival-ish, like the southern states were in support of slavery while the North was against slavery. Now, a lot of the time it wasn't moral reasons for the anti-slavery, it was more business reasons in the North. A lot of people in the North said that slavery could, you could produce goods cheaper with slavery in the South than making it with a hard-working person in the North. So a lot of people in the North were upset that they were working their asses off day and night to build a product, but someone in the South could just would just get a slave to make it. So there were those reasons. There was also moral reasons. There were people called abolitionists who were very anti-slavery. They supported the abolition of slavery. Abraham Lincoln was famously one of their members, or was a supporter of them. However, he understood that this could be a problem, and he didn't demand it in his election, but a lot of people knew he was a big supporter of it, being a big reason for the South's secession causing the American Civil War. So eventually, the American Civil War happened because the South was terrified that Abraham Lincoln, when he was elected, would dismantle the institution of slavery, since the South was so reliant on slavery. In fact, I don't believe Abraham Lincoln, he may have wanted to, but I don't believe the aim of his was to dismantle it because of the known knowledge that the South was terrified of it, and his main aim was to keep the Union together. And when the South created the Confederate States of America and tried to secede, Abraham Lincoln fought a bloody, I think it was 6-year, 1861 to 1865, 5 years. A 5-year war between the northern states being the Union and the southern states being the Confederates. This is still today one of the bloodiest wars America's ever been in. This illustrated to the world that the American idealism of a republic was a failed style of government. It didn't work in the view of the world at the time. America became a very successful nation, but it was at the time that was a view of a lot of European monarchy nations. What ended up happening was America, after the American Civil War, had to recover. Very famous people built up America to become a very successful nation. You will know some of their names. Vanderbilt, very famous train tycoon, built the railways in America. Rockefeller created one of the greatest monopolies the world has ever seen. You will not have seen his names on various buildings, and if you use a car, I suspect you will not be driving right now because of the coronavirus, but if you're pouring a bit of gasoline into your car, I would suspect that Rockefeller probably owned part of that company at one point that the gasoline is from. Because eventually Rockefeller's company was broken up by an anti-monopoly legislation made by Roosevelt, the cowboy Roosevelt, not the wheelchair Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, yeah. President Teddy Roosevelt, and the Anti-Monopoly Act of 1900. I can't remember the name. I can't remember the year. But pretty much, Rockefeller's company was broken up, but he owned virtually all the shares in all the companies. So the breakup of his monopoly actually made him more powerful and richer. As well, there were other people. A lot of famous Americans built up America, and eventually America took part in the Spanish-American War. This saw America take the territories of the Philippines, Guam, not Cuba. It did look after Cuba for a little while. They took Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is now a state of America. Oh, no, it's not a state, a territory. Hawaii's got nothing to do with it. Okay, we'll get to Hawaii. Hawaii was an independent kingdom. There was various powers trying to get power in Hawaii. Eventually, America took it over and made it a state. Eventually, what was it? And as I said about the Japanese, an American fleet or American naval group went over Japan, I would say scared the bejeebus out of the samurai. if that's the simplest way I can put it. Then tried to open up trade with the Japanese in a simple matter of words. Then the Americans also grew in great industrial power, made great advances in technology. What was it? They also did see a rise in problems at the start of the century. A lot of unlawfulness. In the South especially, there was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the southern states, and eventually in the northern states, a little bit in the north as well. President Woodrow Wilson, I won't comment on him, but I believe he may have had some sympathies. I could be wrong on that. But, yeah. You would have to look into that yourself, because I'm not quite too clear on that side of history. But yeah, America was a growing power. It wasn't a superpower at that stage, but it was still a power to be reckoned with. What was it? France. Now, France was a republic at that stage. It had a troubled time. It had lost territory in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870? Yeah, 1870 something. They lost Alsace-Lorraine. They had also had various political problems. Anti-Semitism had risen in France. There was what's the case called? What's it called? Dreyfus, that's the right. Sorry, just remembered. The Dreyfus Affair. France had the Dreyfus Affair that was very destabilizing, where a French Jewish artillery officer, after the Franco-German or Franco-Prussian War, had been accused of treachery or being a traitor working for the Germans. In fact, there was no evidence, and there was actually evidence that a French aristocrat from the artillery had been the one who was working for the Germans, but he was actually given leniency, while this artillery officer, Dreyfus, was sent to Devil's Island, an island off the coast of French Guinea, in South America, and is still French territory to this day. Devil's Island, if you do not know, was a very horrible prison. Virtually people were sent there to die. So Dreyfus, a very honourable man, was sent there, and eventually, I think after a long period of time, couple of years, a lot of people supported him, and Dreyfus was returned to France and was pardoned. Dreyfus actually served his country in the First World War, actually, so we're about to talk about that war. So very honourable man, but the whole affair was very destabilising. It caused a lot of established Jewish families all around Europe to question their loyalty to their countries, because Dreyfus was a very honourable Frenchman from a Jewish family in France. He was serving his country, and still he'd been betrayed by his own officer corps, his own country. So that was another big event that occurred in France. We now move to Russia, that has a Dutch or a Luxembourgian flag. I apologise to any Russian students at the college. I keep bugging up the flag. Russia was an interesting case. Russia was an absolute monarchy. It was an autocratic monarchy state. Britain, even to the current day, Britain's monarchy and the Commonwealth's monarchy to this day works in two systems, the monarchy and the parliament. Both are meant to counterbalance each other. If one gets if one is overtly using power or using power in the wrong way, the other corrects the other. We saw it in Australia in the 1970s, I believe, with when the Governor General fired the Prime Minister for financial problems and a whole lot of other issues. So the Governor General, representing the Crown in Australia, counterbalanced the Parliament. And there's been other instances throughout the Commonwealth's history and Britain's history where the Crown and the Parliament have counterbalanced, so neither have absolute power. However, in Russia, Russia's monarchy had absolute power. That caused some problems. In Russia, there had been great tsars. Tsars are the king of Russia. There had been great tsars, but there had also been terrible tsars. Tsar Peter the Great, Tsarina Catherine the Great, were fantastic rulers. They expanded the Russian Empire. They modernized the country. They did great things to the country. They also did some very bad things as well. Catherine partitioning Poland wasn't too good, and Peter executing people wasn't fantastic either. There's a very famous painting of Peter doing some naughty things. But what was it? There were also some terrible tsars. Ivan the Terrible started off as a very good tsar, but ended up becoming psychotic and ended up murdering quite a lot of people. I believe he burnt a whole city that he suspected of rebelling. He also killed his daughter-in-law, I believe, by kicking her pregnant belly, and I believe he threw his javelin at, I think he whacked his son in the head with a metal rod and made his son's head bleed out, so his son died in his arms. And Ivan the Terrible virtually nearly caused the destruction of his own country. What was it? And I believe started the time of troubles in Russia. I could be wrong about that, but there was also what was it? Tsar Paul, I think Paul I of Russia, nearly caused a diplomatic disaster in Russia. There were, what was it? So there were good and bad tsars. And now, before the First World War, Russia had gone through various wars and had been slowly losing power. Russia had taken part in the Crimean War, where it lost the Crimean War to Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. Nothing significant happened, but it was damaging politically and isolated Russia. They lost their traditional allies of Austria and Prussia. They formed new alliances with France because of French investment in Russia. The Trans-Siberian Railroad was built in this time as well, before the First World War. Many good things were happening in Russia, but the Tsar Nicholas of Russia, was a bad Tsar. He inherited a bad system. Absolutism can lead to a lot of problems. and Russia went to war with Japan over the Korean Peninsula. They were attacked in a surprise attack at Port Arthur in modern-day Korea, I believe. So it might be in China, but it's near that area that borders Korea. As well, the Russians had various political problems. They had people that were demanding reform. There was massacres by the Tsarist, I think the secret police were called the Chechency, or I can't remember the name, but there was a feared secret police for the Tsar, and it caused quite a number of problems. As well, the Tsar's wife, Alexandra, I think her name's Alexandra. Yeah, Alexandra. The Tsar's wife, Alexandra, had a priest called Rasputin. Rasputin was a Siberian monk from the Orthodox Church of Russia, from the Orthodox faith of Christianity. But Rasputin had a very bad history. He was an alcoholic, a drug user. He was infamous for going off with a lot of women. He had a very bad reputation, and it was believed that the Tsar was being manipulated through Alexandra because of Rasputin's meddling. He supposedly healed the Tsar's children, the princes, one of the Tsar's children, his only son, the prince, was, I think he had bronchitis or something like that, an easily curable disease today, but a very bad disease back in the late 1800s and the 1900s as well. Bit late. So Rasputin supposedly healed the child. So Russia had problems, no doubt about it. It had problems. It was still a great empire, but it did have problems. And now the big problem was the Tsar was not very smart. But as well, the German leader was not very smart either. Now we'll leave Russia and we'll move to Germany. Germany had gone through what was called the German unification. There are two German unifications, the one that established the German nation and the one that unified Germany after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We are talking, of course, about the one that established the German nation. Now, Germany was a new powerhouse, or a superpower in the world stage. It had virtually not existed before. The previous state that was supposedly the superpower of the German nations was the Holy Roman Empire, that was made up of virtually Austria. Now, Austria had gone through a decline, so Germany was the new powerhouse of Central Europe. The only problem with Germany was its king was an idiot, or not the smartest chap in the world. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Wilhelm, was not very diplomatic. You can definitely say that. The Kaiser's father was very liberal. His mother was British. His father ended up dying of a disease, or ended up becoming very sick. His mother got British doctors to look after his father. The father ended up dying. The Kaiser ended up having a bit of resentment towards the British because of that. Germany had gone through a lot of progress. Under Otto von Bismarck, Germany was very powerful economically and financially, militarily as well. It had some of the most modern military techniques, being literally in one of the most global modern technological wars to have occurred at that time. What was it? Yes, so Germany was doing quite well for themselves, but it undertook, it wanted to get an empire like Britain, but the only problem with this was most of the world had already been colonised by other European powers. There was a scramble for Africa occurred, and a meeting to make sure there wasn't battles over the African continent called the Conference of Berlin occurred, and various colonies were given to various countries. Modern-day Tanzania and Namibia were given to Germany. Germany also had various islands in the Pacific. It also had part of modern-day Papua New Guinea. So, and part of modern-day Samoa as well. It had the island of Samoa that was, in the old days, German Samoa. So Germany was doing quite well for itself. The problem was, diplomatically, Russia and Germany were not getting along. The problem with that was, Germany was being surrounded by enemies. France and Germany weren't going to get along because of the Franco-Prussian War, and France wanted Alsace-Lorraine back. I know I'm not pronouncing the name properly, but I forgot how to pronounce it properly. Too many maths equations. Not enough maths equations, I say. But what was it? Pretty much, Germany was being surrounded by enemies. Now to the next one. The Ottoman Empire, also known at that time as the sick nation of Europe. The Ottoman Empire was a very powerful empire. As we can see on my chart, founding of the Ottoman Empire, 1299. The Ottoman Empire was founded. The Ottoman Empire were virtually nomadic tribes in the Arabian deserts and around the Middle East. They had eventually destroyed the remnants of the Christian Byzantine Empire that was not called the Byzantine Empire at the time. It was called the Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire was the eastern end of the original Roman Empire. And with the fall of Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, that virtually finished off the Byzantine Empire. It survived for a little bit longer with the islands and blah, blah, blah. Virtually, the Ottoman Empire took over the remnants of the Byzantine Empire. The Ottoman Empire's height was probably 1400s to 1500s, with the invasion of Europe. The Ottomans got far as Vienna, sieged Vienna, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire at the time, and lost. A famous Polish charge of the winged hussars occurred, where the Ottomans were defeated, and a slaughter occurred, or a massacre occurred, pretty much, in the battle. So very famous. What was it? But the Ottoman Empire had been going through problems. Nationalism had been going throughout Europe and throughout the world, and various ethnic groups wanted to be in nations of their own ethnicity. The problem was, large portions of the European sections of the Ottoman Empire were very Orthodox Christian. They were not Muslim. So, what was it? The modern day Greece, Albania, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, what's that tiny little one? Pretty much the Balkan states that became Yugoslavia and started off the First World War were previous Ottoman Empire possessions. However, as the end of the 1800s occurred, a lot of these nations gained their independence from the Ottoman Empire, virtually destroying the Ottoman Empire's power in Europe. This caused the Ottomans to lose power over the world, pretty much, and it was seen that the Ottoman empires would decline even further. The British took advantage of this. The French took advantage of this. Like the Ottoman Empire once reached nearly the end of North Africa on the west coast. What was it? The Ottoman Empire was not doing well. So they wanted to regain power in Europe and throughout the world. They wanted to gain their prestige that they had lost. Now to another sick country or another problematic country in Europe, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you will find out why it was called the Austro-Hungarian Empire very soon. The Austrian... How can I describe this? We will wipe out the board and I will explain Austria because I feel Austria is important to explain. Because it virtually caused the start of the First World War with the internal problems it was having. Virtually, all right. This is France, Spain, and this is a very big chunk of Europe. Now today these are many nations in Europe, but in the old days this was what was called the Holy Roman Empire. None of those names were what it was. So you can tell your... So history has told one of the biggest lies in naming. It was neither holy, because the Pope in various stages did not support the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and it wasn't Roman because it was Germans, not Italians. It was not an empire because literally all this land was never a centralized empire. So, we will get, for virtually the whole history of the Holy Roman Empire, it was never a centralized state. It was squabbling little states, and most of the time they were at war with themselves. You had the Kingdom of Prussia up here with little bits around here. You had the majority of over here being Austria. You had Bavaria. You had Hanover. You had a whole lot of ones. Now, the problem with Austria was it kept, with the collapsing Ottomans, they took over possessions. A fair chunk of the Austrian Empire had Hungary down here. Now, Hungary was part of the Austrian Empire, but Austria kept losing wars. It lost in the 7 Years' War. It lost against Frederick the Great's Prussian, the Kingdom of Prussia, and lost Bohemia to the Prussians in the war previous to that. But the 7 Years' War finalized the defeat of Austria. Additionally, in the German unification, the Austrian-Prussian War, or Prusso-Austrian War, Austro-Prussian War, I believe it was, saw the defeat of Austria, and it saw virtually Germany and Austria split. So Austria virtually got kicked out of the German nations. These defeats and uneconomic gains saw Austria become very weak. It saw also a lot of rebellions. Rebellions which saw the various factions in the empire demand that they gain more rights in the empire. One of those factions was Hungary. Hungary demanded more rights. Eventually, they came to an agreement that the empire would be co-ruled, becoming the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, this is a problem. Nationalism started rising. I think, in the north, the Czechs, virtually everyone was pissed off. Everyone was pissed off. We'll say that to be simple. So virtually Austria had huge problems with nationalism growing absolutely everywhere. No one wanted to be a part of Austria. Well, a lot of people were getting very antsy with Austria. So, there were two groups that grew in the war. Before the war. The Tripartite Pact, Italy, Austro-Hungary, Germany, the Entente, France, Britain, what was the other country? God, this is embarrassing. Entente, France, Britain, and Russia. Sorry, I completely blanked there. France, Russia, and Britain, or Britain, France, and Russia. Now, part of these alliances was to make sure that a war never occurred, because they thought that with these alliances, no one would dare declare war, or one would counterbalance the other. Unfortunately, this caused the war itself. Because when one declared war on one country, it would cause another to declare war on another. Well, I'll show you a diagram. We'll draw a map of Europe. I'll just get a map of Europe up so I can draw it more clearly. Okay, so France, we will start talking about the powers at the time. France was allied with Russia. So to start off how war began to lead up to the Gallipoli campaign. What was it? Russia acted as the protector of Slav people in the world. Pretty much what ended up happening was, with the collapsing of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, various national and Austria had come in and virtually taken over some territories. Pretty much what ended up happening was Slav nationalism had grown quite a lot. The Archduke Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was touring troop training in Sarajevo in I think it was Herzegovina. Yeah, so virtually on June 28th, 1914, Archduke Ferdinand visited Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and was shot by a protester, pretty much, that was protesting Austrian occupation. Pretty much what this caused was the Austrians blamed the Serbians. The Austrians demanded, I forgot what they demanded, but pretty much the Austrians then invaded Serbia. The problem with this was Serbia was a Slav nation that was backed up by Russia. Russia, okay, we'll draw. So Austria invaded Serbia. Austria declared war on Serbia. Because of that, Russia, as an ally of Serbia, declared war on Austria. Because of that, the Germans, an ally of Austria, declared war on... wrong one. Because of that, as an ally of Austria, Germany declared war on Russia. Because France was an ally of Russia, France declared war on Germany. And because of this, now the Treaty of the Tripartite Pact in the First World War between Germany, Austria, and Italy said if one of them was attacked, they all would defend the other. However, this was an offensive war since Austria had declared war on Serbia. So it was an offensive war. So Italy did not take any part on the first bit. Now, the two other important nations. I'll draw Britain up here. Now, Britain. Britain didn't want to really get involved in much of this at the start. However, there was a plan. I will just get the plan's name up. It's quite important. And this plan did not work. I'm just trying to get the name. Okay, the plan for the First World War was called the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was that Germany would go through the lowlands of the Netherlands and Belgium and then attack through the undefended area in the west of France, and then arrive in Paris and defeat the French, and then move forces to attack the Russians. Now, another reason for this plan was they believed that it would take 20 years for the Russians to technologically catch up the Germans. And with the big population the Russians had, the Germans saw it as important to defeat the Russians now rather than later, while they still had a chance to beat them. And as anyone knows about the Second World War, the Russians, with a bit of technology behind them, did quite a bit of damage to the Germans. So, when the Schlieffen Plan happened, they went through a big country that was a bit of a no-no, historically and politically. The country they didn't end up going through the Netherlands. The countries that are in black are neutral. Switzerland, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The Germans never went through the Netherlands, I don't believe, but they went through the Belgian countryside. And now the Germans sent an ultimatum to the Belgians. They said, got 24 hours, let us through. The Belgians declined. So then they started marching through Belgium. The British then sent an ultimatum, said 24 hours, out you go. Oh, not 24 hours, but they said, get out now or we will declare war on you, since you were violating an act of neutrality with Belgium. The Germans declined. Britain declared war on Germany. Now, the Belgians ended up flooding a fair lot of the land that slowed down the Germans, kind of defeating a bit of the purpose of the Schlieffen Plan. That ended up slowing the Germans. It gave the Entente time to regroup. So what ended up happening was trench lines ended up covering all of eastern France, or nearly to the coastline, near to Calais, I believe. I could be wrong. But there was a lot of trench line. Now, and I believe it went all the way to the Swiss border, I could be wrong, but this ended up causing literally a 4-year stalemate with very little gains and a lot of loss of life, a lot of people killed. On the other side, the Russians thought with their superior manpower that would, as it had always worked, they would win wars.